Hi, I'm Femi OK. Today on the stream, legal vote rigging. Kind of. We're going to be looking at the way that some politicians in the US have found a crafty strategy to make sure votes go in their favour by reshaping voting districts. This is known as gerrymandering. I have so many questions for our panel. I'm sure you have as well. If you're on YouTube, you can jump into the comment section and be part of today's show. Hello, David. Hello, Walter. Hello, Katie. So good to have you here. I'm really looking forward to picking your brains to talk about gerrymandering and all of the things associated with it. But first of all, David, please introduce yourself, tell our audience who you are and what you do.
Hi, my name is David Daly. I've written 2 books on redistricting, including one called Why Your Vote Doesn't Count, another called Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. I'm a senior fellow at FairVote.
Good to have you. Hello, Walter. Please introduce yourself to our viewers around the world.
Hi, I am one of the co-chairs of the Maryland Citizens Redistricting Commission, which brings together citizen volunteers from around the state of Maryland to redraw our state's districts. I'm also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute.
Good to have you. And Katie, I love that you're on this show. Tell everybody why. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Katie Fahey. I am the executive director of an organization called The People, and I started a constitutional amendment to change how redistricting happens in my state of Michigan so that we could end gerrymandering.
All right, so I'm going to give you 2 assignments. David, gerrymandering, Katie, redistricting. All right, in 30 seconds. David, you start.
Sure. Redistricting is a great idea, right? Because populations change and people die and new voters come into the system. So you want every district to be equal. The trouble is when you let politicians draw those lines and determine where they go, they can create lines that favor their own side. That's when redistricting becomes gerrymandering. And it has become what used to be a dark art in American politics has become a dark science.
Katie, your take.
Yes, and because we live in a representative democracy, that means that we get to elect people who represent us in our state capitals as well as in Washington, D.C. Who those representatives are and which of your neighbors have the same representative is the process of redistricting. The lines that determine who is your representative get changed once every 10 years after our nation does its census, so it equates for different population shifts. And theoretically, it should be how we actually get accountability for our community being represented in the state capitol and in Washington, D.C.
I love that word theoretically, Walter. Pick up on it, because what happens?
Well, what happens in practice, and this has been going on for a long time, is that the leadership of the legislature goes behind closed doors and they decide who their friends are and who their enemies are, and they give districts to their friends that they can win, and to their enemy, they give districts they can't win. So you can benefit your party by doing this. You can get revenge for old quarrels by writing your worst rival out of his or her district. It is full of opportunities for mischief. And they use it that way.
Yeah, I was talking to my producer a little bit early on and I said, it's sneaky. And she's like, oh, I don't think we should use sneaky. What's a better word? Or is sneaky a good word to use?
I think sneaky is a perfectly good word, because what happens is they do this in secret and then they announce the map, usually too late for the public to have much of a say about it. And so we found in Maryland, when we were doing our hearings, that this had been used to take revenge on particular people by, for example, drawing the district so it had a finger of land so it didn't include their house. So legally, they couldn't run in their old district because there had been a little line drawn around their house, so they weren't legally entitled to run it anymore.
What?
It's crazy, but they do it.
All right, David, I'm going to do a show and tell. This is from FairVote. You know all about FairVote. So I'm going to show it on my laptop, and we're going to go through these 3 graphics, just very simply. So what do we have in number 1, this first graphic here?
Well, I think what you are seeing here is that if you've got 60% of the people, and 60% of them are on Team Blue, and then the other 40% is on Team Red, you would imagine that if things were drawn evenly, right, that you would also then have a 60-40 result. But the way that lines are drawn can determine winners and losers. And that's what is so dangerous about gerrymandering. You could draw these lines in such a way that you have 5 blue districts and 0 red districts, or you could draw them in some wild other ways that even create 3 red and 2 blue districts.
This is very wacky.
Even though there's 60% red. And this is how communities get cracked, and it's also how maps no longer become responsive to partisan changes.
So you could just slice it up sort of evenly like a cake, or you could do it like a little bit here, you can have the cherry, you can have this big chunk. Katie, that is very strange. How did you experience that cake being divided up in a very bizarre way?
Well, there's actually an example right by my house where on one street there are 6 houses and they are in 3 different House of Representative districts. So those people, their kids ride the same school bus, they have very similar concerns, they have the same water, the same services, and when they go to vote, they're voting for 3 separate people even though they live on the same street. And that's just one of the ways that even practically it can be really confusing and hard to understand who your representative is because of gerrymandering.
I did say to our audience that you can be part of the conversation, particularly if you're on YouTube. So let's go to this YouTube comment here. This is from 72 Marshflower 15. Especially given that they count prison populations in rural areas, though prisoners aren't allowed to vote. So that's part of some strangeness happening in redistricting. And then Hermes says, gerrymandering is based on political discrimination. The minority it discriminates against is the political minority. Water, do you want to go on that first? I'm actually going to get all of your takes on this, Guess.
I will, because on the first point, my state of Maryland, I believe, was the first one to enact a law in response to that potential unfairness of rural areas with prisons having much more representation than they would otherwise get because they count the prisoners even though they can't vote. So we passed a law to redistribute those people back to the communities that they had lived. It's a little bit more paperwork, but our legislature saw that as fair. Now, on the second point, it's, well, let me pass it on, actually, to the others.
You're very generous. David, go ahead.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in there. I think that what we have seen in this country over the course of the last decade or so is that the technology has become so good as these map makers draw their lines that they are able to, your commenter is concerned about a majority discriminating against a minority of voters. And I think that what we have come to see is that some of our most competitive states, our most 50-50 states, places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, Michigan, states that are ordinarily very, very competitive, have been drawn in such a way that even a majority of citizens cannot change their own legislature when they stand together. After our 2018 elections, there were 59 million Americans who lived in a state where one or both chambers of the state legislature were controlled by the party that won fewer votes that year. That's nearly 1 in 6 of us. So I think that one of the dangers of gerrymandering is that it has exacerbated minority rule.
Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, the foundation of a representative democracy is that the voters should be able to hold the government accountable. And when these lines are drawn in such a way that they are predetermining who is going to win and what party is going to win, because they've looked at the math and they've seen, okay, we're guaranteeing this many kind of the voter that we want is here, and this few number of voters are over here, then people can't unelect ineffective representatives. Or if a representative is going and trying to make sure that maybe there's somebody of the same party running against them, and they are looking at where the other house is of that competitor and drawing them out of the district, you're also having incumbents who are deciding that they want to rule regardless of how the voters feel, which is the complete opposite spirit of why we even have a democratic republic in this country.
Yeah, it goes.
And let me.
Yeah, go ahead, Walter.
Yeah, let me say a word about polarization also, because in a cleverly done gerrymander, you will take the opposition party, the party that is out of power, and you will pack their voters. You will find where they live, and you'll draw districts just around them and make those, let's say, a quarter or a third of the districts in the state. Now, it's very good for winning yourself a majority, but that means that the minority party, the outs, their people are very concentrated, and they tend to become more extreme because the legislators that are left in that party have to listen to this super ideological bunch of voters from their base. They don't get the benefit of being in an electorate that has more people from both sides. And so this contributes, I think, to what has been seen as the polarization of American politics, in which there are fewer people running toward the center of the political spectrum.
And dare I offer a very crude description of what packing means? So you put, say, voters of colour in 2 districts, so they obviously win those 2 districts, for instance, but then all of the other districts around them will then become non-districts of colour. So basically, white and black.
Yes, it can work very much that way.
Yeah.
And of course, it can also work with, let's say, liberal versus conservative. If it's the conservatives doing the mapping, they may take college towns, for example, that, traditionally very liberal. And, maybe they'll draw a district that has all the college towns strung together. And they get rid of a lot of their most committed voters into one district. So you pack your opponents that way. And what you are left with, it will often have a working majority of your own voters, even if your own voters are not a majority in the whole state.
All right, David, help me tackle this if I may. I'm going to play to you some thoughts about gerrymandering and the impact on communities of colour. Have a listen to the video and then immediately respond. Let's take a look.
Redistricting is when we redraw political boundaries to account for population shifts we see in the census every 10 years. But at its core, redistricting is about power. That's why every cycle we see some groups try to strategically manipulate or gerrymander the process to increase their own power at the expense of others. They'll do this by dividing those other groups into multiple districts so that they can't collectively use their power, or by packing them up into one district so that they don't have a voice in multiple districts. That most often happens to communities of color.
And not having those communities' voices heard affects the laws that are possible to be passed and the direction that our entire country is going to take. So we would encourage communities to come together, organize, make sure that their voices are heard during the redistricting process to ensure that our country moves forward in a more fair and just and equitable way.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that we are a multiracial nation. The last U.S. Census showed it, and we are going to see through this redistricting process whether it's possible for us to become a multiracial democracy, which I'm not sure we've ever had great success with in the history of our nation. You could see this in Texas just today when the new congressional maps were announced there. The population growth in Texas has been driven by communities of color. 95% of the population growth there that won the state an additional 2 seats in Congress this cycle was driven by Latino, Asian, and other population growth. And yet what you see on the maps that were drawn today is that actually the number of white majority seats increases, the number of Latino seats decreases, and the number of black majority seats moves from 1 to 0. That is just how powerful these lines can be.
I think the important part to really remember as part of that is that when politicians are drawing these lines, they are just thinking about the election, and they are thinking about, how do I get at a guaranteed 51% of the vote? They don't care then about the other 49% of the people who are living in their district. And how that really impacts minorities is they not only don't have a person of color who's representing them and who has shared worldview and is thinking about their perspective in office, but you now have a representative who feels pretty sure that for the next 10 years, they can actually ignore that community and they only have to keep their base happy. They aren't actually looking at all of the constituents that they represent, which again, I would say goes against kind of that core piece of what our democracy is supposed to be. You should be looking out for the communities that you are representing, not just a voter of one type or another.
Yes, I have so many questions for you. Walter, hold that thought if you would. Let me give you this point to Andrew, because everybody can see that you've got so much expert knowledge, guest, so it's nice to have you here. Andrew says, this has been discussed for years. How is it that nothing changes? Walter, you take that.
Well, the question is always who can change it. And at the state level, in most states, you have to go to the state legislature and ask them to change their law to deprive themselves of power. Most of them say no. That's why most of the interesting reforms that have gotten through in the last 20 years have gotten through the so-called initiative process, in which voters in California and other states can sign petitions to put a law on the ballot. Well, that's a way of getting around the politicians. And as far as Congress goes, Congress has some powers under our Constitution. It hasn't used them for reasons that I guess could be hard to explain or could be easy to explain, which is they don't want to
I'm scared to say, try me.
People don't realize, but for a period of American history, there was actually a law passed by Congress, totally constitutional, saying that districts had to be compact. Now, we haven't introduced that word yet, but it's a huge difference between reasonable districts and unreasonable districts. It's that if they're compact, they're more likely not to be a gerrymander. Well, they could pass that again, but again, the question is, can you get a majority of the House of Representatives to vote for something that might make it a little less likely for them to get reelected? That's why I like the idea of the public learning about this, putting pressure on their representatives, saying, we know that you're letting this go on. We want it to stop.
I've got another question on YouTube. Some good questions, YouTube. Keep them coming. Is there anyone, any party that defends gerrymandering? David.
They all do it.
Everyone's laughing because what I didn't say, but I should have said earlier, is that Republicans gerrymander and Democrats gerrymander. Some parties, though, are better at it than others. David, answer the question.
We have had gerrymandering in this country as long as we've had politicians. You can trace it back to, Patrick Henry trying to gerrymander James Madison out of our very first Congress. It gets its name from Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Massachusetts back in 1812. His party tries to draw state Senate seats around Boston in such a way that a political cartoonist thought they looked like a salamander. And the gerrymander was born, and poor Elbridge goes down in infamy. What I would say is that in many ways, from Patrick Henry's time all the way up until 2000, in many ways, what you had was the minor leagues of gerrymandering. You had politicians who were trying to draw lines that kept themselves and their pals in power. Walter often calls this a buddymander, which is a term I love, and I'm thrilled that I was able to sneak in first ahead of him. But I think that in 2010, something a little bit different happens, and that is in many ways because the technology of redistricting explodes. The computers that are used are so much more powerful. The map-making software is so sophisticated. The big data that's available on all of us, the public data as well as the private data that is available, you upload all of that into these systems, and the politicians are able to quickly draw these districts that go up and down streets, picking which voters they want and which ones they do not. In previous decades, we've seen that gerrymanders would sometimes lose their power over the course of a decade as politics changed or the lines just faded as new voters came into the system, or as some issue forced a realignment. And what happened over this last decade is the power of the lines, especially in state legislatures around the country, never ever weakened. And it's one of the reasons why I fear for the cycle we're about to enter now.
One more question from YouTube. I'm going to put it to Katie. Excuse me, Walter. Sorry about that. From YouTube, can you legislate this away? And I'm asking Katie because Katie did exactly that. Tell us your story very briefly, Katie.
Yes, so I was really frustrated knowing about gerrymandering, and I actually made a Facebook post one day saying, hey, I want to end gerrymandering in Michigan. If you want to help, let me know, smiley face. At the time, what I didn't realize is that in Michigan, citizens can actually write laws themselves, gather a bunch of signatures. For us, it was a little over 400,000. And then the people can directly vote on whether they want to change that or not. And when it comes to gerrymandering, there's kind of three main parts you want to change, but one is who draws the lines. Right now, the politicians in office are literally getting to pick and choose who they want their voters to be. So we shifted that to an independent commission of citizens that have Democrats, Republicans, independents, and are not at all in the political space. The second way is you want to change what is the criteria for how you draw those lines. So Walter brought up compactness. That is an example of a criteria. We also could directly say that gerrymandering should be made illegal. So our state constitution, now thanks to millions of Michiganders who voted yes that we needed to change this, it now is illegal to guarantee or draw these lines in a way that will advantage or disadvantage one political party or one candidate over another. And the last part is you can make it so that the data that's used you can actually track, instead of in many states where state legislators are literally hiding in bunkers, not letting people know the data or why these maps are drawn. And you can actually require that they have to go around the state and talk to the public, which is the other thing that we did.
I'm going to bring one more voice into our conversation, guest, and that is the voice of Brady Shears, because Brady is talking about reform. Have a listen, and then I really would like your very brief points on what could be done better, because the map has to be drawn some way, doesn't it? Here's Brady.
I think one thing that gets left out of the redistricting debate, and why it's such a contentious issue in the first place, stems from the fact that the number of seats in the House is honestly quite arbitrary. As it stands now, there are 435 members of the House, and it's remained that way since 1929. Yet the population of the United States has grown over 3 times of that of what it was in 1929. The number of representatives hasn't kept up to pace. I think it's time to have a serious discussion about increasing the number of seats in the House. And one instance where you can see these deleterious effects is in my home state of Arkansas, where over a third of our population votes for the Democratic Party, and yet out of our 4 congressional districts, 0 are represented by a Democrat. Increasing the number of seats in the House makes it harder for parties to draw maps that would advantage themselves and would ensure fair and accurate representation for all.
So let me show you some egregious examples of modern gerrymanders. So rather than being compact, as guess you've brought this word up, compact, these districts are all over the place. How is this even a district in North Carolina, district number 12? That is bizarre. So what do we do in order to change that? Briefly, Walter, you start.
Well, Katie put her finger on criteria. You want things that judges can enforce. Compactness is pretty good that way. Not breaking county lines or city lines is pretty good that way because the judges can measure it with numbers. In Maryland, we go pretty far with our experiment with the Citizens Commission, which is we are forbidden to look even at voter registration numbers about party. We are forbidden to look at past election results or at the residence of any individual. Now, that's strong medicine for keeping politics out of the process, right. But do it that way.
Walter, I'm going to move on to David very quickly. David, go ahead.
I think we need to rethink our entire process, and our process ought to look a whole lot more like those around the world do, with larger multi-member districts that use ranked choice voting to elect a number of representatives. I think your viewer was absolutely right when they talk about how 100% of the members in states like Arkansas or Massachusetts or Kansas or Connecticut are red or blue, but all of the citizens are not. And that contributes to polarization as well. And I think if we had a more proportional system, we'd have better politics.
And finally, Katie.
I think citizens should be driving these decisions. We live in a country that is supposed to have the people at the center of it, the people being the ones to decide how our government is run. And citizens should be deciding how many representatives do we think is fair, how many districts do we feel like gives us accurate representation, so that our concerns and our tax dollars that go and pay our politicians can be distributed in a way that we think aligns and actually gives us good government and actually gives us representation.
Katie, Walter, David, thank you so much for talking to the stream about gerrymandering, redistricting and reform. I'm going to give the last word to Shelby. Shelby, I love what you suggested on YouTube. Provide people with the tools to advocate for themselves and their communities. I'm going to wrap up now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.